You already know the story. In 1971, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo took 24 ordinary college students, randomly assigned half of them to play guards and half to play prisoners in a mock prison in the basement of a Stanford University building, and watched ordinary people transform into something disturbing within days. The guards became cruel, the prisoners became broken. The experiment had to be stopped after 6 days because things had gone too far. You've probably heard this story presented as one of the most important findings in the history of psychology, proof that ordinary people, given the right situation and a little bit of power, will inevitably become monsters, that it isn't about who you are, it's about where you're placed. There's just one problem. It didn't happen the way you were told, and the real story is far stranger, far more troubling, and far more revealing, not about human nature, but about how science can fail, how stories spread, and what we choose to believe when a narrative is compelling enough. Let's start with what actually happened. For decades, the Stanford prison experiment sat at the center of introductory psychology courses worldwide. It was in textbooks. It was cited in court cases. It was invoked to explain Abu Ghraib, to understand genocide, to argue that situational forces override individual character in almost any human context. Zimbardo himself built a career on it, writing a book called The Lucifer Effect that extended the experiment's conclusions across the entire landscape of human evil. And then, in 2018, a French documentary filmmaker named Thibault Le Texier began going through the original archive, the tapes, the notes, the documents that had never been fully examined by anyone outside Zimbardo's own circle. What he found was not what the textbooks described. The guards had been coached, explicitly. On the first night of the experiment, a research assistant named David Jaffe, who was also playing the role of warden, told the guards to be tough, to be firm, to not show sympathy. He used the phrase, "tough guys." The guards hadn't spontaneously become cruel because the situation had transformed them. Some of them had been instructed to be cruel and were performing a role they understood was expected of them. Prisoners who tried to resist, who maintained their composure and refused to be psychologically broken, were largely written out of the experiment's official narrative. One prisoner, identified later as Richard Yako, reported that he and others had deliberately acted distressed because they believed that was what the study required. The breakdown wasn't emerging from the situation, it was being performed for the cameras and for the researcher who was watching. And the researcher watching was not a neutral observer. Zimbardo had placed himself inside the experiment as the prison superintendent. He had a direct personal stake in the results, matching a dramatic outcome. When a colleague named Christina Maslach visited the experiment and was horrified by what she saw, she was one of the first people to question whether it should continue. Zimbardo's initial response was defensive. He saw her objection not as a scientific concern, but as a disruption to something that was working. When Le Texier published his findings in a 2019 paper titled Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment, the response from the psychological community was significant. Other researchers began re-examining the original data. What they found confirmed Le Texier's conclusions. The experiment's methodology was catastrophically flawed. There was no control group. There was no standardized measurement. The participants knew they were in an experiment about prisons and power. The guards knew the researchers wanted to see certain behaviors. The entire setup was less a controlled scientific study and more an elaborate piece of theater in which everyone, including the director, was playing a part. This doesn't mean the experiment found nothing. It means what it found wasn't what it claimed to find. Here's where the real story gets genuinely fascinating. The power of the Stanford prison experiment was never really in its data. It was in its narrative, a story about ordinary people becoming monsters, about the situation being more powerful than the individual, about the terrifying thinness of the line between civilized behavior and cruelty. That story was compelling. It confirmed something many people already suspected or feared about human nature. It gave psychological language to a feeling that most people carry, that there but for the grace of circumstance go I. And that narrative spread not because the science was rigorous, but because the story was irresistible. Psychologist Elliot Aronson, one of the most respected figures in social psychology, has spent decades studying the mechanisms by which human beings protect their beliefs from disconfirming evidence. He calls this cognitive dissonance reduction. When a story we've integrated into our understanding of the world turns out to be wrong, the discomfort is not just intellectual, it's personal. Our past judgments, our past confidence, our sense that we understood something, all of that is threatened. And so we resist. We find reasons to preserve the original story. We emphasize the parts that still seem right and minimize the parts that have been discredited. The Stanford prison experiment has been questioned question challenged and substantially debunked for years, and yet it remains in textbooks, it remains on syllabi, it remains in popular conversations about human nature and situational power, because the story is too good to let die. But here is what the actual evidence, the more careful, more rigorous research that followed, actually shows about situational power and human behavior. The situation does matter enormously. Decades of careful research in social psychology have established that context, social pressure, authority, and role expectations genuinely influence behavior in powerful ways. The Milgram obedience experiments, which have their own methodological controversies but a much stronger empirical foundation than Stanford, demonstrate that ordinary people will comply with authority figures to a degree that is genuinely alarming. But the lesson is more nuanced than Zimbardo's version. People are not simply overwhelmed by situations, they make choices within them. In the original Stanford experiment, not all guards became cruel. Several refused. Several went out of their way to be kind to prisoners, smuggling them extra food, finding ways to ease their conditions. These individuals, who behaved humanely under the same situational pressures as the cruel guards, were largely invisible in the official story Zimbardo told. Their existence is inconvenient for the clean narrative. If the situation automatically produces cruelty, why didn't it produce cruelty in everyone? The answer is that character matters. Moral identity matters. The values an individual carries into a situation shape how they respond to its pressures. The situation creates conditions. The person still chooses. This is the finding that the Stanford prison experiment accidentally buried by getting so much attention for the wrong conclusion. Not that situations turn good people into monsters, but that situations create conditions in which the choices people make reveal who they already were. The cruel guards were not transformed. They were given permission. The kind guards were not immune to pressure. They chose, against that pressure, to remain themselves. That is a far more uncomfortable truth than Zimbardo's version, because Zimbardo's version lets everyone off the hook. If the situation is everything, then moral failure is a structural problem, not a personal one. You didn't become cruel. The situation made you cruel. The responsibility dissolves into the environment. The more accurate version puts the responsibility back, not entirely, not without acknowledging the real power of context and pressure, but enough to matter. Enough to say that the guards who refused, who stayed decent, who smuggled food and spoke kindly, made a choice, and that choice was available to everyone in that basement. The Stanford prison experiment told a story about human nature that was too simple, too clean, and too convenient. The truth it accidentally pointed toward is messier and more demanding. Situations shape the landscape, but you still have to walk it, and how you walk it is, in the end, still on you.